Good evening, fellow history lovers. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War. And tonight we are talking about the First Continental Congress, and it took place at Carpenters Hall back in 1774. I'm joined tonight by Dan Welch, who's also
Good evening, fellow history lovers. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War.
And tonight we are talking. I had to mute myself. Sorry about that. Joined by Dan Welch with Emerging Revolutionary War, and our special guest tonight is Michael Norris. He's the executive director of the Carpenters Company, coming to us from Philadelphia. So thank you, Michael, for joining us. Welcome to Emerging Revolutionary War's Rev War Revelry this evening about Carpenters Hall and the First Continental Congress.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, we really, we like to be the home of America's 250th anniversary. We've been following along with lots of anniversaries. This fall, this September and October mark the 250th anniversary of one of the most important stepping stones to revolution, the First Continental Congress, which took place at your site. I thought we'd start off tonight by just talking a little bit about Carpenters Hall. So can you tell us a little bit about what is Carpenters Hall?
Yeah.
People who may have never heard of it, have never been to Philadelphia, and don't know much about it.
Yeah, sure. That's a good place to start. So Carpenter's Hall was built in the early 1770s. Actually, it was finished only months before the First Continental Congress happened. It was built by an organization called the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia, which in the 18th century was a guild of master builders, right? So folks who designed buildings and oversaw their construction. It was kind of a mashup of what we have now in terms of sort of architects and contractors. But back then, that was all, all one person. So there was a very active guild of master builders in Philadelphia that was established here in 1724. So this year is, in addition to the 250th of the First Continental Congress, it's actually the 300th anniversary of the Carpenters Company itself. So we're commemorating multiple anniversaries this year. But our organization was actually kind of modeled on and inspired by an earlier organization, a medieval trade guild that's in London, called the Worshipful Company of Carpenters, that was founded in the 1200s, right? So they're much older than we are, but our early members were either members of that guild in London or were descendants of members of that guild, and they started here in Philadelphia what they were familiar with from back in England. And so the guild sort of set standards for design and construction of buildings. They trained apprentices. There was a sort of a mutual aid component where if someone was injured or wasn't able to work, the company would help them financially. So, and then about 50 years after the company was founded, they built this building, which you can see behind me, Carpenter's Hall, as their meeting place. So its original purpose was to be the meeting hall for the guild, for the Carpenters Company. It still serves that purpose today. That's one of the things our visitors are often fascinated by, which is to learn that the Carpenters Company actually still exists. And it is now a professional association of architects, engineers, and contractors, leading members of Philadelphia's building community, right, are really our members and the stewards of this wonderful building. So it's been serving its original purpose as a meeting hall for the company for 250 years. So that's kind of cool. And then, of course, we can layer on top of all that all of the history related to the Revolution and the Continental Congress.
That's really interesting. it must be interesting to to actually design and build the building that a bunch of carpenters are going to be in, probably nitpicking every little thing going.
Yeah, so lots of cooks in the kitchen, but that's a good thing. As I always tell my peers at other historic sites, if you want to be responsible for a historic building, it helps to have a lot of people around who know buildings, right? So I'm certainly not. I'm not an architect or a contractor. So I really rely on our members who have deep, deep expertise around construction and historic preservation, right, to help us, guide the way we care for the site.
And do you all know about how many people were in this guild at the time, and then also how what the membership's like today?
Yeah, so today we have a little over 200 active members. We've had about 1,000 members in our entire 300-year history.
Wow.
Um, and in the revolutionary period, it fluctuated, but it was usually between 70 to 100 members, right? Again, that obviously changed and grew as the organization went into the 19th and 20th century, and membership categories expanded, and became more defined. Master builders kind of evolved into contractors, and then architects became kind of a separate thing. So then they were added later, right? So the membership has clearly evolved in terms of who's eligible, and we're really at the highest level of membership that we're aware of that we've ever had. So that's exciting.
Now, and we'll get here into the first Continental Congress, but the building, like you said, its original purpose is for these meetings of the guild. Uh, was that were they always was it always just going to be for that use, or did they rent it out for other things, or was it used by the community in other ways?
It certainly was, right. So the company did they raised money through loans from the members to, fund the construction of the building, which of course meant those loans had to be paid back. And one of the ways that the company generated revenue to pay back the construction loans was to rent the space out, right? So we were always renting the space out in different ways from the very beginning. And in fact, the library company of Philadelphia, the nation's first subscription library that Benjamin Franklin founded, was housed on the second floor of Carpenters Hall from 1773 to about 1790, right? So all through the Revolutionary and post-Revolutionary period, the library company was renting space from us on our second floor. And there's various parts of that story that become fun and relevant, and maybe we can talk about those in a bit. But we then, in the federal period, when Philadelphia was the capital in the 1790s, we rented space out to some of the federal agencies. A building that's adjacent to Carpenter's Hall that you can see on the other side of me, was rented out to the Department of War in the 1790s. So there was always an active way for other entities to use the building. The first Bank of the United States rented our space while their building, which is just across the way from us on Third Street, was being constructed. The bank itself operated out of Carpenter's Hall, so that went on. It went on for a very long time. In the 19th century, the last sort of long-term tenant was an auction house who used the first floor. And the company sort of took some grief in the press by renting what by then had become sort of a sort of sacred site in the history of our country. to this sort of crass commercial operation where apparently you could like come in and, buy a chicken or whatever. So that was the last tenant that we had in the middle of the 19th century. But of course, we still do rent the space out now for special events and, meetings and things like that. But we haven't had a long-term tenant in the hall since about the middle of the 19th century.
Oh wow. So yeah, that sounds like yeah, originally yeah, mainly for this for meetings of the guild, but really used for multiple purposes throughout its whole history. Wait,
Yeah, right. And lots of places use the space to organize themselves. The Franklin Institute, which is our big science museum here in Philadelphia, was founded in 1824. Their first exhibit was at Carpenters Hall. So there were all those kinds of things. The building was definitely sort of almost an incubator, I guess, a word we would use now to talk about hosting groups that were forming, whether they were social groups or civic organizations. In the 19th century, a lot of labor unions, through the connections to the building trades, actually organized themselves in Carpenters Hall. So there's sort of a whole fascinating history about the use of the space beyond the First Continental Congress.
yeah,
Well,
wow.
I know one of the things I hope that we can get to if we don't run out of time towards the end. You were talking a little bit about in the mid 19th century. I know Benson Lawson becomes a pretty big proponent of restoring the building back to its historic usage and landmark. And I think that's one of the unique roles of or the history that you have is here how do historians in the mid 19th century react to landmarks of the 18th century and the early founding of the country. And so I think that's a great segue into talking about the role that it has in the 1870s and the lead up to the 250th anniversary of those events.
Yeah, so the building was chosen to host the First Continental Congress. There was much discussion about where the meeting would be held. It was clear that Philadelphia made the most sense as kind of centrally located up and down the seaboard. But within the city, there was a lot of back and forth about where the meeting should actually be held. The State House, what we now know as Independence Hall, of course, was a top contender, and many of the Pennsylvania folks wanted it to be held there. But ultimately, the decision was made to have it at Carpenter's Hall, in part actually because of the presence of the library upstairs, right? There was several delegates, John Adams included, remarked on the presence of the library as kind of a wonderful selling point to have the meeting here. And the library company allowed the delegates to be able to, check out books, right, and use the library. So that was a major selling point. It was also conceived or perceived as, sort of politically neutral, right? It wasn't the State House, right? It wasn't the seat of British colonial government, which the State House clearly was at that time. So there was a sense that it was neutral. It was private, right? The doors could be locked, the shutters could be closed. To have privacy. So that was certainly another selling point. And some historians have commented on sort of the perception of the Carpenters Company as a kind of working class trade guild to help build a perception that the discussions that were happening around the colony's grievances with England were not dominated by sort of elites or the upper class, which one can argue that point, but but the perception of the building as being connected to trades and craft and working folks, to some historians has also been a reason for why the site was chosen.
do we know the guild themselves? I mean, you talked about how there's this deep connection with England. Do we know how they felt about how they actually felt about the grievances that the people had?
We do a lot. Most of our members, although not all, during the Revolutionary period, were certainly on the side of independence. Many of them were of Scottish and Irish descent. Right, obviously, lots of drama between those folks and the English. Right, so they tended to default towards independence. Many of our members, including the guy who built the building, Robert Smith, who was a Scottish immigrant, were active in the Revolution. He designed maritime defenses called chevaux de frise, which were submerged in the Delaware River to stop British warships from coming into Philadelphia. So he was actively engaged. They discovered buried in a bunch of silt and mud about 20 years ago one of those chevaux de frise, and you can now see that on display at the Independence Seaport Museum, which is just a few blocks from us. But not everyone was, Philadelphia was the biggest city in the British Empire outside of London. There were lots of social and economic ties. Certainly many people, and certainly some of our members, were not in favor of any sort of political separation. And even though we're known for hosting this Congress, only one member of the Carpenters Company was actually a delegate to the First Continental Congress. A guy named Samuel Rhodes, who was very active politically, later became mayor of Philadelphia. But he was a master builder and member of the Carpenters Company. He actually designed Pennsylvania Hospital, again, just a few blocks from us, as the nation's first hospital. So, while most of our members were supportive of gaining independence, only one of them was actively involved in the Continental Congress.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now you mentioned there's discussions about, and they ultimately settle on Carpenters Hall. Do we know who's the decider on these kinds of things?
So it's not completely clear. Massachusetts was kind of driving the conversation a lot of this because of, obviously the stuff that had already happened had mostly happened up there, the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, the Intolerable Acts, etc. A lot of this kind of strategizing for the First Continental Congress was happening from the Massachusetts folks, John Adams, Samuel Adams. But they were also they were keenly aware that it couldn't just be about them, right? And that ultimately became the whole point of the First Continental Congress, was creating sort of unity, right, and consensus and a coalition, right? So they very clearly knew that other colonies had to kind of get on board, right? Certainly including Virginia, right, which was the largest colony, and very, very influential, clearly, politically and strategically, right? So the president of the First Continental Congress was a member of the Virginia delegation, right? Not a member of the Massachusetts delegation, as you might imagine. So I think it was really, at least from what we know, from what was written down about the choice, it was sort of a consensus decision, with the hall being positively perceived by most of the delegates, right? But it wasn't even clear when they all started showing up, late August, early September, where the Congress was actually going to happen, right? So, they kind of went around and sort of checked out the other sites and, came to this decision in early September.
Yeah. So when do they first, I guess, officially convene? And like you said, I mean, it sounds like it's not entirely set in stone, a lot of this stuff. So how did how did the first Continental Congress, I guess, get started
Yeah.
in Carpenters Hall?
Yeah. So the first day was September 5th, 1774. And, they basically, um, just sort of convened themselves and said, here we are. And the on the second day was mostly preoccupied with a discussion about um, should there be an invocation, and who should give that invocation. That discussion ended with a decision to invite Jacob Duché, who was the rector of Christ Church. Um, Again, just a few blocks from us, and sort of the preeminent Anglican church in the city. Of course, Pennsylvania was founded by William Penn, a Quaker, and was known for being, sort of a religiously tolerant city. And there were many other congregations, not just Anglicans, here. But Duché was again perceived, even though he was an Anglican minister, was perceived as someone who would be able to sort of speak to all of the delegates who might not necessarily be Anglican, right? So he agreed to come give an invocation. That actually happened on the third day, September 7th. And his invocation kind of became immortalized as the first prayer in Congress. And there's kind of a whole history about faith and Congress and democracy and prayer, which is again quite fascinating. And a lot of that derives from the fact that they chose to start the meeting off with this invocation. Coincidentally, one of the things that Duché read was the daily psalm for that day, September 7th. And that's Psalm 35. I was not familiar with Psalm 35 until I learned this history, but I encourage anyone to go read it. It's quite fascinating because it's a very sort of almost violent psalm about war and retribution. And so again, sort of it was coincidence because it just happened to be the psalm for that day in the Anglican prayer book. But when you read it, knowing what was going on, and of course what ultimately happened, right? It's quite striking.
Yeah, no, and we talked about independence before, but I mean, the ideas of independence or war and all that kind of stuff it seemed like this gathering was an attempt to avert much of that, and try and stay within the British Empire,
Right.
but all their grievances. It sounds
Right,
like.
right, for sure, right. So, the one of the primary sort of outcomes of the Congress was the Declaration of Colonial Rights, right? And so, like, just the name of it tells you, right, they were not trying to be independent, right? They were just trying to establish their rights as British subjects, and explaining how they felt those were being violated. So obviously things, changed much dramatically as we get into 1775. But here in the fall of 1774, for the most part, there was an attempt to find a kind of diplomatic, resolution.
And this is significant because this is the first time there are delegates from how many colonies at this point, and had there ever been a meeting of that many colonies up to this point?
Yeah, so there were 12 of the 13 colonies participated. Georgia did not participate, and that was from what we understand, primarily because they were involved in sort of a frontier skirmish with the indigenous population at that time, and were sort of reliant on the British Army to help them deal with that, and so they didn't want to sort of risk that protection by appearing to, sort of go rogue by coming to the Congress.
This whole Congress is kind of extra legal,
Oh,
right?
for sure. Oh, yeah, there's no question, right? Like we don't think of that now, but because we think about, oh, it's the Congress, right? It's the US government. Well, there was no US government. There was no US, right? The individual colonies established, in the wake of the Intolerable Acts, right? Committees of correspondence had sprung up, right? Those folks were asked to identify delegates. Colonial assemblies were being dissolved, right? And sort of new kinds of assemblies or legislators at the colony level were being established, right? Some of those legislators chose who the delegates were who came to Philadelphia. So yeah, so all of that was happening in sort of a very extra legal way for sure, right? But yes, there was a Stamp Act Congress that had met in the 1760s, which kind of fizzled out and didn't really create any sort of lasting impact. So this was the most sort of successful colonial convening across the colonies, up until that time. And certainly, I mean, John Adams had never left Boston, right, until he came to Philadelphia in 1774. And thank God he was a, avid journalist, in terms of keeping a journal, because he, wrote copious notes about his experiences at the Congress and really in Philadelphia, outside of the Congress. That's one of the ways we know a lot about what was happening, sort of outside the Congress, where folks were going to have dinner and parties and, sort of all of the complimentary stuff that surrounded the meeting itself.
I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this Congress to me is this is the first meeting of a lot of these personalities that are household names for us today. Is
Right.
amazing to think of them first meeting each other in that building, which is fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, we don't, we also maybe think of there being, sort of a strong sense of unity and everyone was on the same page. That was just clearly not true. And much dissent and discussion and debate. But we do, I do think that the fact that they were able to come to some agreement about what they wanted to do and to do that in a collective way, was significant, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the big takeaway from this Congress was the creation of the Continental Association, right? The idea that the colonies should, and would act together, right? And coordinate their actions and their behavior and their responses, right? And to do that in a very formal way, right? Through signing the Articles of Association, which is kind of the other big takeaway from the first Congress, was really a turning point, right? And that sense of the consensus and the coalition of the colonies. We, our docents, and we talk about when we talk to our visitors, right? We say this is where the United States was born, right? Because before this meeting, colonies were often, were acting in their own best interests, were not talking to each other. They were oftentimes having their own disputes with one another, right? About borders or trade or, anything. And obviously those things still continued on some levels, but the creation of the Continental Association really paved the way for what we now know as the United States, right? So that's pretty important.
So Mark, raised the question of, we have in this room for the first time a lot of people that a lot of strong personalities that haven't met each other before. They're now thrust into this position, and they're getting to know each other. And one of the things I'd like to ask is, do you have any favorite, colorful stories or writings from some of the participants on their thoughts of who some of these other players are in this room? And my second follow-up to that would then be, with all of these personalities and the later becomes a realization of this historic moment, what are some of the best books today to further deepen the conversation regarding this moment in American history?
Yeah, that's a really good question. As we've talked about this anniversary and planned it, right? I mean, a lot of sort of mainstream public history, sort of glosses over, right? The First Continental Congress. There hasn't been a lot of intense examination of it. I would certainly recommend Mary Beth Norton's book, 1774, which is really wonderful overview of kind of everything that was happening in the colonies in that year. And she calls it the long year of 1774, and she stretches it out really to Lexington and Concord. So lots of good stuff there. Um, David McCullough's book, 1776, again, sort of does a little bit of prologue about our events. So, there are some good sources, but there hasn't been a lot of intense examination of the, sort of the day-to-day, discussions and politics. John Adams's journals, which you can read online, are quite fun. And because he was, writing to himself, he was not shy about saying what he thought about people. So, that's definitely worth looking at. Of course, sort of the kind of big sort of symbol crashing moment of the First Continental Congress is Patrick Henry, right? Making his statement that the distinctions between Virginians and New Englanders are no more. Today we are all Americans, right? Those words were captured by several delegates, and again, really sort of crystallized this point I was just making, right, about the sense of consensus and coalition and unity and how important that was. So, but there have been many dissertations written about the First Continental Congress, and we're actually talking to a few folks about trying to publish something that's kind of a little more consumer oriented or for the general public that goes into into more detail about what actually happened.
One of the questions that I just asked in regard to some of the colorful personalities and the stories that come out from there. Can you talk to us a little bit about, and pardon me if I've mispronounced his last name all these years, Francis Damon,
Yes, well, right,
the librarian.
right,
I'm a self-described bibliophile. I have my own home library. Many of us, in Emerging Revolutionary War, the folks that are tuning in tonight, all are very
yeah,
proud of our bookshelves. So tell us a little
right.
about the librarian.
Yeah, so Damon was the librarian of the library company, and as I said, the library company was operating in Carpenters Hall, so it was essentially where he came to work as the librarian. He was from France, right? Was an immigrant here. He had kind of a side hustle where he was teaching French language courses. And there's wonderful ads that he was running. You can see these, in the colonial press, ads that say "Learn French at Carpenters Hall," right? Which is quite fun. So he actually played, a really significant role in kind of the second most historic thing that happened in our building, which was after the First Continental Congress, when Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1775. Franklin was not at the First Continental Congress. Nor was Thomas Jefferson, just to, make that clear. But but so when Franklin returned to Philadelphia in the spring of 1775 and joined the Second Continental Congress, he was kind of tasked with sort of dealing with the French thing, right? Like, how are we going to engage the French as our ally? And what do we do about that, right? So through his influence and connections, an ambassador came over from Versailles to meet with the Continental Congress. That all happened in secret. And they met in Carpenters Hall on our second floor in the space that was being occupied by the library company. And the reason they did that was because of Francis Damon. They needed someone who could interpret this secret ambassador. Some people call him a spy, which sounds much more dramatic, but he did travel in secret. They certainly didn't want the British to know that that was happening. But so they met in on the second floor of Carpenter's Hall in December of 1775 for a series of meetings at night. And Damon was the translator, right? The interpreter for those meetings. So he has I guess, somewhat forgotten, but obviously quite important role to play in the creation of the French-American alliance, right? So, of course, if any of you have been watching the Apple TV show that's on right now with Michael Douglas about the alliance, where after these meetings in 1775, Franklin actually goes to France to continue those negotiations. So, just a little personal side note about Francis Damon is that when the Library Company of Philadelphia is still around, you can still buy a share in the Library Company. I'm a shareholder of the Library Company, and when I purchased my share, I was given a list of they have a finite number of shares. So whenever you get a share, you're taking over the share of a share that had belonged to many other people through the centuries. And so they give you a list of like, these are all the people whose shares are open. Coincidentally, when I became a shareholder and was given a list of people, one of the people on that list was Francis Damon, right? So I said, I want that share, right? So I now personally am the owner of the share of the library company that belonged to Francis Damon, which I think is just super cool.
That's really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's fantastic.
All right. So the first Continental Congress, it lasts from September 5th. How long does it go? And then, and basically, how do they end up? You mentioned the formation of this Continental Association, but what do they close out on?
Yeah, right. So it lasted till the end of October, so about 6 weeks. They created these documents, as I mentioned, this kind of declaration of rights and grievances, the Articles of Association. They also wrote a letter to King George, sort of a petition, and they submitted a letter to the British people, right, in Great Britain, right? So because they were trying to make a case to the sort of general public in Great Britain that that they were being mistreated and that those folks should support the colonists' attempt to address these grievances. So those were kind of the four takeaways or outputs from the Congress, along with really a decision or a statement that there would be another meeting, right, if the grievances were not, sort of satisfactorily addressed, right? And that meeting was set for May of 1775. And then the Congress disbanded, right? And everyone went back home to kind of wait to see what would happen. Well, we kind of know what happened, right? In April, the war started, right? So when that second Congress started, which was about, I think, less than a month after Lexington and Concord, it obviously became a much different matter, right? To think about how do we win a war and pay for a war and, build an army and sort of all that stuff, right? So um, that's not our story to tell, but
Why did the second Congress not come back to Carpenters Hall?
yeah, so to our understanding, it's really again because of the war, right? So this sense that um, the meeting should be quasi-secret and shouldn't take place in the seat of colonial government, it didn't really matter, right? Once the war had started, right, and there was open rebellion, right? The king had declared everyone, had declared the colonists in rebellion. And so there just wasn't, and of Georgia did come for the Second Continental Congress, so there were, a few more people. And they did move the Second Congress over to the State House. However, they did continue to use the library, right, in Carpenters Hall, even during the Second Continental Congress. There's a wonderful letter between Jefferson, of course, who came to the Second Continental Congress, asking someone to pick up a book for him at the library in Philadelphia. So we know that the library continued to be used.
That's and also just, I mean, closing out the first Continental Congress too. I think it's and this was dramatized also in the John Adams miniseries too, of just kind of this is the first congressional meeting that everybody walks away with nobody happy, or everybody
Right.
is on different things. And it seems like, the more radical members who wanted to go further didn't get that. And it's just kind of interesting to see. This is like one of those first moments of this intercolonial coming together. And I think, there's a lot of, we view it today as now this continuum that starts there, that continues up to the modern Congress. But I think at the time it must have been incredibly frustrating for such different interests, yet trying to come together as American colonists who all kind
Right.
of view the outrages they were being subjugated to. So
Yeah, and you sort of had to have patience, right, as a leader or a legislator, because there were, while there were some uh, you know, decisions were made and coalitions were built and documents were signed, right? Sort of what was going to happen next was not something anyone knew, right? And of course they weren't like, emailing these things over, right? You had to wait for a ship to cross the ocean and a ship to come back across the ocean to kind of know what a response was, right? And so I think it's hard for us now to sort of relate to what that must have been like, right? The sense of being in limbo, right? And not and respond, being able to respond to what happened, and you just, you don't know, and you have to be patient.
and try and be patient, especially for the Massachusetts folks with whose port is closed down. And
Right.
and that's got to be much longer do we have to wait before we're gonna get some sort of action done?
Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
but also seeing, I think, recognizing the importance of that unity, that all of these colonies together were much more powerful and could send a bigger message together rather than
Right.
13 separate
Yes.
colonies.
Right. For sure. I mean, I'm kind of on a mission to make the Articles of Association be, established as a significant document in our history. It's obviously been kind of overshadowed, although um, Abraham Lincoln actually cited the Articles of Association in his inaugural address in 1861, right? So we tell this story to our visitors a lot because we want people to know that, even though we might today not know a whole lot about the First Continental Congress and what it meant, Lincoln, when he was building his case for defending the Union as president, and he gave his speech in March of 1861, right? So like weeks before the Civil War broke out. He said the Union predates the Constitution and predates the Declaration of Independence and goes back to the Articles of Association in 1774. So I just love that statement because it shows that, in the context of that part of our history, it resonated and was significant, and that it gives me hope that there is a possibility that we will be able to resurrect the significance of the Articles of Association in the broader public consciousness.
And I think you all are doing some of that on your site, and I want to get into that in just a second. But before we get into that, I just want to ask, because you mentioned, this meeting that Franklin has. What happens to Carpenters Hall also during the war? Because obviously Philadelphia is occupied by the British. Do they understand the significance? Is there any sort of retribution? Does the library survive? That kind of stuff is interesting to me.
Yeah. So, the building was occupied by the British. When Philadelphia was occupied, that happened at the State House as well. So we do know that the building was used for a time as kind of a clinic or a hospital for wounded British soldiers. And as far as we know, the library did continue on the second floor. And then after the occupation, obviously the company, Carpenter's Company, continued to use the space, but there were other uses. There's some evidence that munitions and gunpowder for the Continental Army were stored in our basement. So we know that there was some use of the hall for Revolutionary War purposes.
And I think that, one of the great stories that comes out of your site, which often I think it might get overshadowed because of the more important role of the political side of things, the congressional side of things, as the city of Philadelphia, kind of transitions and prepares to that war footing. Can you talk a little bit about the formation of the Light Horse at Carpenter's Hall?
Right. So again, that was the formation of what's now called the First Troop, right? Happened at Carpenter's Hall. Pennsylvania did not have a standing militia, right? Because we were founded by Quakers. And so lots of volunteer militias started to crop up. Franklin himself started one of those. The cavalry unit organized itself here in November of 1774. So it's also their 250th anniversary. And we will be doing, we always co-celebrate with them in November of each year, but we'll be doing some sort of extra special stuff with them this year to commemorate that, right? So again, just sort of another wonderful Philadelphia thing that has managed to stick around for a very long time.
Well, that's a great segue then into some of the programming that you're going to be having at the site to mark all these 250ths that are coming up. And I don't know about you, Mark, but I can't wait to get there in September as well. So if you can talk a little bit about the preparations and the programs that are going to be happening in the coming months.
For sure. I mean, we're well into, we kind of made this whole year an anniversary commemoration. So we've already done some of our commemorative programming in April and May. We had a series of public public demonstrations of historic trades and crafts. That was sort of a connection to the history of the Carpenters Company rather than the Continental Congress. But those were wonderfully attended and received by the public. We had about 1,000 people come watch some blacksmithing demonstrations, which getting those approved by the Park Service was fun, but they were fully on board, and it was a wonderful series of weekends. So that's already happened. In just about a week from today, we will be starting the Young People's Continental Congress. That's kind of our flagship commemoration of the First Continental Congress, and um, we wanted to do something that felt very relevant and contemporary, and that was inspired by history, but would really engage young people in discussion, right, and engagement around democratic and sort of civic issues. So we'll be doing a 5-day sort of immersive history and civics education here this month, next week. The group of delegates are coming from the 13 original colonies. We decided to let Georgia come, even though they weren't at the First Continental Congress. And then next July, we'll do the program all over again with delegates from all 50 states, actually 56, counting all the jurisdictions, right, and territories, right? So, and coincidentally, there were 56 delegates at the First Continental Congress, right? So it's kind of wonderful kismet that we have 56 states and territories now. So next summer, we'll be having that full national contingent going through that same program. So that's a really wonderful way to showcase not just our site and our involvement in that history, but because it's Philadelphia, right? We'll be taking them to Independence Hall and to the Museum of the American Revolution, and they'll get to see all of what Philadelphia has to offer, which will be really a lot of fun. And then in the fall, in September and October, for when the Continental Congress was actually happening, we're partnering with a wonderful organization here called Historic Philadelphia Inc., which, among other things, does living history programming, and we've commissioned them to create a new series of sort of living history vignettes that partly sort of reenact what happened at the First Continental Congress, but mostly sort of give you some of the context, right? And sort of paint the picture of what Philadelphia was like at that time and what people were saying who weren't necessarily, in the room, right? And how was it being received by regular citizens, right? So those vignettes will take place, again, free public programming on Saturdays and Sundays, all throughout September and October. So we're very excited about that. We are working on some specific commemorations around, very specific things that happened during the Congress, like the first prayer. We'll be convening. I'm really excited about this. We're going to be convening a group of faith leaders from all the historic congregations near us. Most of whom were here in the Revolution, and we're going to have a discussion with those faith leaders today about their perceptions of the role of faith in the Revolution, and also the role of faith in our democracy now. So I think that's going to be a really wonderfully provocative discussion that again sort of takes the history and makes it feel very present. That'll be early in September, around the time that the first prayer actually happened. So later in September, we're doing a program around Paul Revere's ride, right? So your folks probably know that Paul Revere made many rides, not just the one that we all know about. In April of 1775, one of those rides was to Philadelphia during the First Continental Congress, right? So in September, mid-September 1774, after the Suffolk Resolves were adopted in Massachusetts, Revere rode to Philadelphia because that event was deemed sort of significant enough in Massachusetts that they wanted the folks that were meeting here to know that had happened, right? So Revere rode to Philadelphia, right? So we're going to be sort of commemorating that ride. It may or may not involve a guy on a horse. We haven't figured that out yet, but but we are partnering with the Revere House in Boston on that. And I see it as an opportunity to not just let people know that Revere came to Philadelphia. I think a lot of people in Philadelphia will find that fascinating, but also to tell the story of the Suffolk Resolves and what again a sort of forgotten turning point, in the road to revolution that was. And then in October, I mentioned that we were, inspired by our predecessor organization in London, the Worshipful Company of Carpenters. We actually have a group from the Carpenters Company in London, which we to this day have a very friendly relationship with. We'll be visiting Philadelphia. So we're really excited about that and giving them, showing them some of the sites and having some, fellowship and festivities. So that's towards the end of October. And then we're sort of capping everything off with a big gala event, dinner at the Bellevue Hotel in Center City, which is where the Carpenters Company hosted their 200th anniversary gala in 1924. So we're going back to a site that we last visited, 100 years ago. So anyway, so that's a quick overview of what we'll be doing. And then in November, as I said, we'll be working with the First Troop to sort of commemorate their anniversary as well.
Doesn't sound like you got much going on this year.
I know. I know, but like I said, we feel like this is it, right? We got one chance. This is our year. We're the sort of we're paving the way to 2026. And, we wanted to just do as much as we could to remind people that, there was a pathway to independence. It wasn't just something that magically happened on July 4th, 1776, right? So this is how we get to do that. So yes, we'll be tired, but this is our moment in the spotlight.
Well, that's fantastic. I can speak for anybody who's watching this. He's never been up there. Definitely highly recommend, when you're up in Philadelphia to go check out Carpenters Hall. And as Michael's just mentioning, if you got to go, this would be the year to go. It's the 250th. A whole range of activities. If people want to plan something or learn more about these different events, where could they go to get that?
Yeah, certainly. We're posting all this stuff on our website, carpentershall.org. So certainly feel free to check that out. The hall, we are open 6 days a week. It's free. There's no admission. Yeah, I encourage folks to stop by.
Well, and like I said, and anybody who's watching who, Emerging Revolutionary War is planning to make a trip up there too. So hopefully we'll be coming to you live up there sometime in that September and October time frame during the 250th of the First Continental Congress. But I think it's wonderful you all are pulling out all the stops and doing all this great stuff. And I especially, that you all are working to reach that next generation of American citizens, so that they know how significant this history is, and can hopefully carry that on into the 250th year of the Republic. So
for sure. I mean, I feel like not just we at Carpenters Hall, but anyone who's involved in this commemoration has to see that as the primary goal, right? Of even having a commemoration of the 250, right? If we can't value and understand our founding principles, and what those mean today, and certainly for young people whose job it will be to, kind of take the reins of citizenship and leadership. I feel like we've failed them. So yeah, so that's we're doing our little part in that for sure.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for joining us this evening. Thanks, Dan, for joining me as well. And we'll be back on in 2 weeks. And check our announcements. We'll either be coming to you live again here on YouTube. I think we may have figured out the technical difficulties and might be coming to you live from Facebook. But regardless, you'll find these videos on both. And if you want to catch these on our podcast, we post them all wherever you get podcasts as well. But thank you again, Michael, for
Thank you.
and